Good morning, First Baptist Church, and welcome to this time of spiritual reflection as we look at the book of Amos. We're actually in chapter 9 today. This is the final chapter of this book. I have thoroughly enjoyed walking through the book of Amos as we've looked at this prophet from the south as he has the courage, or in fact, he has to gain the courage because he is called by God to go up and speak a harsh word to the people up north. We've looked at this for a little over 2 months now. We're going to finish up today. And then next week, we will look at another minor prophet. I haven't decided on who exactly we will study. There are a few to choose from, but we will move on to a minor prophet because that we will stay within the minor prophets for this Tuesday spiritual reflection. So chapter 9, I've encouraged you throughout this journey to download the Message version of the Bible, which is Eugene Peterson's version. I've used this in Bible studies before, but this is such an approachable way to read Scripture. So I would encourage you to download that version on the Bible app. This is pre-recorded because of the scheduling conflict, but I will still hopefully be around to be able to interact with you. This will be posted at 10:30. But if you would like to interact in the comment section below, I strongly encourage you to do so. Say hello, offer a prayer request. Please know you are welcome to comment. Chapter 9. I will read the entire chapter. It's somewhat lengthy, 15 verses, and then we will discuss the text. I saw my master standing beside the altar at the shrine. He said, "Hit the tops of the shrine's pillars, make the floor shake. The roof's about to fall on the heads of the people, and whoever's still alive, I'll kill. No one will get away. No runaways will make it. If they dig their way down into the underworld, I'll find them and bring them up. If they climb to the stars, I'll find them and bring them down. If they hide out at the top of Mount Carmel, I'll find them and bring them back. If they dive to the bottom of the ocean, I'll send dragon to swallow them up. If they're captured alive by their enemies, I'll send a sword to kill them. I've made up my mind to hurt them, not help them. My master God of the angel armies touches the earth, a mere touch and it trembles. The whole world goes into mourning. Earth swells like the Nile at flood stage. Then the water subsides like the great Nile of Egypt. God builds his palace, towers soaring high in the skies, foundations set on the rock-firm earth. He calls ocean waters and they come. Then he ladles them out on the earth. God, your God, does all this. Do you Israelites think you're any better than the far-off Cushites? Am I not involved with all nations? Didn't I bring Israel up from Egypt? The Philistines from Capthor, the Arameans? But you can be sure that I, God, the Master, have my eye on the kingdom of sin. I'm going to wipe it off the face of the earth. Still, I won't totally destroy the family of Jacob. God's decree. I'm still giving the orders around here. I'm throwing Israel into a sieve among all the nations and shaking them good, shaking out all the sin, all the sinners. No real grain will be lost, but all the sinners will be sifted out and thrown away. The people who say nothing bad will ever happen in our lifetime, it won't even come close. But also on that judgment day, I will restore David's house that has fallen to pieces. I'll repair the holes in the roof, replace the broken windows, fix it up like new. David's people will be strong again and seize what's left of enemy Edom, plus everyone else under my sovereign judgment. God's decree, he will do this. Yes, indeed, it won't be long now, God's decree. Things are going to happen so fast, your head will swim. One thing fast on the heels of the other. You won't be able to keep up. Everything will be happening at once, and everywhere you look, blessings. Blessings like wine pouring off the mountains and hills. I'll make everything right again for my people, Israel. They'll rebuild their ruined cities. They'll plant vineyards and drink good wine. They'll work their gardens and eat fresh vegetables, and I'll plant them on their own land. They'll never again be uprooted from the land I've given them. God, your God, says so. The subheading for this chapter, at least in my Bible, reads like this: Israel thrown into a sieve. And you know what a sieve is. A sieve is like a modern day kitchen colander. So we use a colander, for example, when we have spaghetti. And we will cook the spaghetti. We will place the noodles into the colander, and then we will shake the colander so all the moisture will come off the noodles. Also, when we have ground beef, we'll cook the ground beef. We'll pour it into a colander, and then we will sift out the grease. And so that's the purpose of a colander. It's to sift out what you don't want or what is not healthy for you. We find in this text that God is going to sift out the sinners, sift out the bad. They will be thrown away. So those bad apples who have neglected the poor, and these are themes that we find throughout this book. Neglected the poor, whose worship is hollow, who are only concerned with themselves, who are only concerned with gaining wealth. God will sift them out. God will place them into a colander, and only the good and the healthy will remain. So we're getting ahead of ourselves because this is toward the end of this chapter. But let's go back to the beginning. And in the beginning of this chapter, it's all bad news. As we've seen throughout this book, I mentioned this before and I'll mention it again. If you're really, really depressed today, maybe you shouldn't watch at least the first half of this session, because it is depressing. Basically, God says Israel cannot hide because I'm going to shake them. I'm going to kill whoever's alive. No one's going to get away. If they go up to Mount Carmel, I will bring them back down. If they climb up to the stars, I will bring them back down. I'm going to hurt them, he says, and not help them. So God appears to be at God's wit's end with the people. No more, God says. I've sent this prophet Amos to be able to grab your attention and to turn you back into my direction. God says it has not worked. And so God says, this is when I'm going to throw them into a sieve. In the middle part of this chapter, God asks this question: am I not involved with all nations? And then in verse 9, am I not giving the orders around here? And so we see that God is not just the God of Israel. God is the God of all nations. We read something akin to this in the first part of this prophecy, in the first few chapters, where God says, I'm not just going to judge Israel. I'm going to judge everybody. Nobody is outside of God's purview. God is a God of all, not just a God of the Israelites. Obviously, they are God's chosen people. But nevertheless, when God sees injustice, when God sees evil, God brings down retribution on all. So if one nation is unjust, God is not going to stand for that just because they're not his chosen people. God is a God of all. And so he reminds them this by asking these questions. Am I not involved with all nations? God is a God of all nations. There is not one nation on this earth who is outside of the hands of God or the grasp of God. God is powerful, we see. I'm going to step backward here, back in verse 5 and following. When God touches the earth, Amos says, it trembles. And I actually failed to mention this, but at the beginning of chapter 9, Amos says, I saw my master standing beside the altar at the shrine. So he actually sees God. He is there to witness God. And so he's there to witness when God touches the earth, it trembles. The whole world, he says in verse 6, goes into mourning. So this is a powerful God who has the ability just by his touch to make the earth tremble. So if the Israelites do not believe that this God is serious, all they have to do is see God and feel God touch the earth, because when God touches the earth trembles. So God is powerful. God is a God of all nations. God is a God who pronounces judgment. And so it's all bad news until verse 11. Now, verses 11 through 15, we think were added by a later writer, a later editor. So most biblical books were written over a long period of time, and then ever so often a later writer, editor would come back and edit the book, and he or she would add things, or they would subtract things, just like an editor would do today. An author submits a manuscript to an editor, and they say, oh, we need to get rid of this, or we need to change something about this to make it more readable, or to make it a better read. So we see the same thing in Scripture. Now, this doesn't mean that Scripture is any less true, that Scripture is any less sacred. So just because someone other than Amos probably came years later, starting in verse 11 and wrote to the end of this chapter, or added this section of Scripture, that doesn't mean that this Scripture is fallible. It just means that God is still speaking. And God was still speaking to this editor, and God says this: I will restore David's house. So he describes the people of God like a shanty that has to be renovated. I'll repair the holes in the roof. I'll replace the broken windows and fix it up like new. So this is God saying, you were broken, and yet I still want to mold you into something beautiful. So there's still hope. Nevertheless, there's hope. And then God says this: they'll rebuild their ruined cities. They'll plant vineyards. They'll work gardens, and I'll plant them. I'll plant them on their land. They'll never have to be uprooted again. So I think what he's saying is, because this was written in the 8th century as the people of God were going into exile, God is saying, you're not going to have to go into exile again. You've gone through this. You've been broken. You've been battered. You'll never have to be uprooted from your land again. And then at the end, God, your God, says so. So this ends in a word of hope. On Sunday mornings, when I preach a really, really tough text like I did this past Sunday, the text about the Canaanite woman, I always try to end in a word of hope, in a word of good news, because there's so much bad news in the world. And I know that you come broken and battered on Sunday morning from a long week. And so I do want to end in the good news. I want to let you know that there's hope. Amos does the same. There's a lot of bad news in this text because the people of God are not living in the ways that God has called them to live. But yet God's not done with them just yet. There will be a remnant. God will take the people of God who look like a broken down house that is no longer livable, and God will make it livable. God will restore and God will renew. So I hope that you will find these ending words to be good news. That just when you think God is done with you, God says there's still a little bit more work left to do. We'll see you again next week at 10:30 on Tuesday, and we'll look at another minor prophet. Thanks for joining us.